We can begin today with our top story, layoffs mounting in big tech. Spotify announced it will lay off 6% of its workforce in a bid to bolster sagging profit margins and, well, make money. This move comes after the company laid off 38 people in October at its podcast division. The music streaming giant joins a slew of tech companies led by Microsoft and Salesforce, announcing layoffs to cut costs. Yahoo Finance tech editor Dan Howley is here with the analysis. Dan.
That's right, Brian. Let's just go over the number of layoffs that we've seen so far. We actually have it broken down here in this chart. We'll start off, obviously, with Amazon. They laid off about 18,000 employees. We have Meta at 11,000, Microsoft at 10,000, Salesforce at 9. It keeps going down to Twitter, although that's a little bit of a different story because it's more about the Elon Musk story and his debt. And less about the economic conditions. But, obviously these gigantic companies facing these layoffs, and now Spotify with these 600 employees, a lot of this clearly having to do with the overexpansion during the pandemic. We had the companies like Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Google going out and really kind of bulking up their workforces, thinking that there was a new normal for the world, really, as far as they needed to be employed. And then, they ended up having to cut back as we've seen that new normal kind of fall apart and the economic conditions kind of go south. But, Spotify, obviously, as you mentioned, they had big investments in their podcast division. They had layoffs there. People are still waiting. Investors are still waiting for that to really pay off $1 billion. They got the Joe Rogan experience. They have others in there. And so this really is kind of just a piece of the larger story of the tech industry and how we've seen this lavish spending followed by these steep cuts. And we're talking, places like Google and Meta cutting back on some of the things that employees have kind of leaned on as some of the big perks. And so, if you're an employee at one of these companies, you rely on the stock price and you're seeing it fall, obviously that's also hurting you as well as the layoffs.
Yeah, definitely. And when we talk about these layoffs, too, from the folks that we talked to last week in Davos, we heard from a number of executives on the layoffs, and they talked about that they're not necessarily going to be universal, right, across the board. Listen to what they said.
Anything that has people implications are probably the hardest decisions we have to make as executives, but at the same time, they are the right thing to do for the success of the company.
I think it's pretty difficult to say. I think the next couple of quarters are really going to tell us what's really going to happen in the economy.
We will continue to reallocate resources. In fact, we continue to hire in some areas where we need the talent.
So while we are not in a position to have to do layoffs, we certainly have, slowed down hiring a bit during the back half of the year.
I think when we see a lot of peer companies laying people off, when we see people in the tech industry really struggling, the idea of throwing in flying in a big performer, spending a ton of money on a lavish party didn't make a bunch of sense.
Of course, that last thing is Matt Prince of Cloudflare, thank you. My brain is still scrambled.
We're still defrosting, Julie. We're still defrosting.
He's sort of throwing shade at some of his compatriots there in Davos who did have big, lavish parties. Something else I wanted to ask you about, Dan, as we talk about Spotify specifically, is Don Ostroff leaving the company, the chief content officer. Is that sort of a sign that Spotify's strategy of really doubling down on podcasts in particular is not what they're going to continue on with?
Yeah, I mean, look, podcasts obviously have exploded in, recent years. People continue to listen to them, but it doesn't seem to have gotten the payoff that investors had wanted from at Spotify. So, you could read this as a questioning of whether or not they'll continue to dump as much as they have into the podcast space. Obviously, they're going to continue to offer podcasts. But, yeah, I think it does really kind of lead you to believe that they're clearly unhappy with where the state of things are as far as the podcast business goes.
All right, Yahoo Finance's own Dan Howley joining us to break down the latest in what we've been tracking in this broader wave of tech layoffs as well, hitting Spotify today. Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate it.